Hello, everyone. My name is Kerry Ramirez. I'm the Managing Director of Studymove. And thank you so much for joining this, our fourth key data update of 2021. It's a pleasure to host this session. And wow, it has been once again a few very interesting months for the international education sector here in Australia. It seems that we moved from navigating the wave of COVID-19 to being a roller coaster of emotions with positive news, not so positive news, and to be fair, confusion around the main topic that it's important for the sector, which is what's going to happen with the opening of international borders. And that's the main topic that we're going to share with you. We're going to share with you our analysis of what can we expect for 2022, what we can see as some of the main drivers that will affect your international education strategies next year. And as always, I said, this is just part of an analysis that hopefully will complement your institutional views, the things that you have actually considering in the way the market has been actually moving along. So I had a good, interesting presentation for you. So I will go through the presentation and then, as I said, the aim of this session is all about what can we expect in 2022. And as we move in this process of dealing with COVID-19, it's interesting that we see some light in the horizon. It seems that we are finally able to leave the cave, but there's still a lot of uncertainties in what could happen next year. And as this is exactly what I'm going to share with you, some of the things that we see in the market that I think going to be very useful. But before we really get into 2022, I think it's very important just to take a step back and really see what happened in the last 20 months. Because the last 20 months have been by far the most challenging period for the international education sector here in Australia, and of course, all around the world. But it has been a very, very difficult period for everybody. I think that when you are actually doing what we do, it's a lot harder because our industry is actually closely related to personal relationships. And we have been closely seeing how, the dreams, the expectations of thousands and thousands of students have been taken away as a result of COVID-19, and how this really has been affecting us not only at a rational level, but also on an emotional level. And the fact that we are 20 months later enduring this and with up and downs, but we're still, I think it's something that we should be actually very thankful. And I respect deeply the work that you have done just to keep this sector alive under the most challenging circumstances that we have ever experienced. And interesting to see that in the last 20 months, after 20 months of challenges, border closures, and all the things that happened, we are still taking care of more than 470,000 international students. That's the latest figures of the number of student visa holders that we had in August here in Australia. And I think it's remarkable to see that after 20 months of challenges, we're still looking after the experience of nearly 500,000 individuals. And that's remarkable to see. And it's something that we need to remember and you need to consider to put in perspective the amount of work that has been done just to keep this moving and to take care of these students. Also, it's remarkable to see that in the last 20 months in higher education here in Australia, more than 150,000 students commence their program. Regardless that we have the borders closed, regardless everything that is happening, 150,000 students decide to engage with Australia as their preferred study destination. I think that shows the amount of work that has been done, not during these 20 months, but also in the past, and everything that it has been put together just to still connect with this large number of students, even under very, very difficult conditions. So that's an impressive number, in my opinion. 150,000 new students in the last 20 months have started courses, regardless the fact that the borders were closed during this period. But it's also this is a sector that has been putting the students at the center of what we do, and you know perfectly that's the case. We always take care of our students, and we look after the students of the experience of the students. And a good example is this is something that not a lot of people have talked about in the last 20 months. But back in February 2020, before we closed the borders, the university sector rallied and did an extraordinary effort just to put together what it seems is the largest repatriation of Australian citizens that we ever had. More than 25,000 Australian university students. I'm talking about domestic students who were abroad before the pandemic started. They were repatriated before the borders were closed. And all this was done by the support made by the university sector. And that's a remarkable work done. And I think also shows how important it is just to put the students at the center of what we have done. But also in the last 20 months, we have done a lot of innovation. For example, the number of online degrees available for international students has grown significantly. For a handful of online degrees, and I'm not talking about a few subjects, I'm talking about complete degrees. In 2021, we have now more than 2,000. We actually multiplied the number of online degrees available by 4. Not only duplicate, not only triplicate, we quadruplicate the number of online degrees, which was a tremendous effort. And I think it's some of those stories that sometimes we forget because we're in the middle of all these difficult situations. So I know that nothing is perfect. I know that things have been really hard, but there has been a lot of work done, which I truly believe is going to help us just to move forward next year. And that's exactly what we're going to talk now. We're going to talk about what can we expect in 2022. And at the moment, we're in a very interesting kind of crossroad with a lot of confusion, with a lot of things. Some states, they open some borders, some others don't open some borders, some others, they offer quarantine. And unfortunately, that has been kind of a natural development of the things or the way in which we have been moving along with COVID-19. But we truly believe that in the next few months, all that confusion is going to fade away and we're going to be able to operate in a more kind of normal way. And I'm going to just show you some interesting stats and some of the factors that we believe it will influence what we will do and how we're going to be able just to engage with international applicants next year. Before I really get into the core of the analysis, I just want to share with you some of the plans that we have as a Studymove. We really going to say thank you to everybody for the support that you have been giving us in the last year. It has been extraordinary to be part of your journey and to support you with relevant data and analysis that will help and helps in the development of your strategies in these very uncertain times. For next year, we'll continue providing the sector with our key data updates. It's something that we receive a lot of positive feedback. Something that we might change next year is that for our clients and the people who actually work closely with us, we'll have some special study key data updates with more in-depth kind of analysis. So that's something that will keep you posted in the way in which we move ahead. We also are putting together our 2022 data shop reports. This is a large number of reports that will help you. It's actually reports that help in the development of your international student recruitment strategies. And we are currently working in the 2022 set of reports. And also next year, we're actually focused on more of our professional development workshops. And we're also gonna open a new product that it's all about the analysis with data of your digital strategies. That's something that we know that the sector requires. You are putting a lot of effort and money in putting together digital strategies. So we're actually going to help you into crunching those numbers and see how the performance of digital strategies is really affecting or not your overall international student recruitment strategies. So we will send you more information. I think that probably Dimitri can put more of the details in the chat now, but if not, we actually will send all the information to you a little bit later. Just very quickly, in regards to our 2022 data reports at the moment, and this is something that some universities request, we're actually having a promotion because a lot of you want to lock in your report for next year. So if you want to lock in the reports for this year, you can actually do it now. And to everybody who wants to do it, we're actually keeping the 2021 prices for your 2022 reports. And we can send you more information about it. And also, briefly, some universities have been very happy with our workshops. These are face-to-face or online workshops in area of data. We understand that a lot of the teams, especially in the area of recruitment, are actually interested in learning more about how they can actually use data to improve their student recruitment strategies. But also we are doing that for the area of digital strategies as well. They have been very, very good. We had some really good sessions with some several universities, and we can send you more information about it. So for more information, we will provide you all the details very soon, but you can also feel free to contact us as well. All right, let's just get into what we think we can expect in 2022. And there are some very interesting data that will show us some light during this period of confusion of where we are heading. Today, I'm just going to talk about some of the external forces that will define 2022. I think that a lot of the narrative and the analysis that we see in our sector is always looking at how we do things. But we need to understand that in this journey of opening borders, there are many other things. There are many other economic factors, political factors. So we're going to talk about a little bit of what we think are going to be some of those forces that actually are going to affect what we're doing next year. We're also going to talk about a very interesting topic, which is competition. We know that the fact that other study destinations are opening their borders quicker than us will affect what we do in 2022. But we'll take some time and some minutes and we'll provide you with some data just to see where those competitors are going and how they're actually doing, just to have a better understanding of where it could actually be affecting our operations in 2022. I think with that topic of competition, it's very easy just to say, oh, all the students are going to Canada. Well, it's not the case. We really need to drill down and see what really is happening with those competitors. And also, I'm going to share with you some scenarios, some very simple scenarios, just to have some perspective of where we're going to be in 2022 and how we can actually progress in the next following months. Okay. Starting with this topic of external forces, I think it's very, very important that we understand that at the end of the day, we are part of something bigger. I know that in the international education sector, we don't want to think like that. We always like to think that we are the center of everything. And unfortunately, in the way in which we're going to move forward, is not necessarily that we're going to be able just to draft our own destiny for the next year. There are going to be other things that will affect the opening of the borders. And that could be a good thing, but also could be a bad thing. I think in the bad side of things, because we are not used to the fact that we don't take the destination or the way in which we're moving forward out of our control. But in the other hand, you will see that there's some interesting data that will show that basically it will give us some reassurance that international borders, they will open very soon and they will remain open. This is the first chart that I want to show with you. This is coming from the Australian Bureau of Statistics that basically is giving you the number of overseas arrivals in Australia in 2019. This is before COVID-19. I know it sounds like a decade ago, but it's not so far away. It was 2019. In 2019, we received 21.6 million arrivals from overseas in Australia, a huge number. I think this number itself shows how important it is just to have international travel for this country. International travel is something that is at the heart of Australia. We have a large population that has connections with, family, cultural connections with outside of the country. But also for a lot of businesses, it's very, very important just to engage with international business. And as you can see from these 21 million international arrivals, it's about 2.1 million of them are actually Australian citizens. It's people like you or me or many others who go outside of Australia. You go to an international conference or people who do business, you come in and out. So that's a very, very important large number of the arrivals that we have. From there, we have 9.4 million of what is called short-term visitors. And this is basically individuals that come to Australia for many reasons, just to have a holiday or to actually undertake an education program. This is basically our students, or for a conference or just for business purposes. And this is how these 9.4 million arrivals distribute across the main categories. As you can see, 4.4, the vast majority is tourists, which is a really, really important part of the economy and growing the economy in this country. From there, we have about 675 who just come to do business. Then we have education. Then we have people who come to a conference. And then we actually have skilled migrants that they come to perform certain jobs, especially in the agricultural sector. Now, as you can see here, education represents a very small part of the large number of arrivals that we have in Australia. It's about 6.5 of the short-term visitors, not only the total. From that 9.4, we're only 6.5, which, as I said, means that we are a very small part of a bigger picture. But this, as I said, that seems like, oh, this is not great, but actually shows that there are very strong drivers and very big forces that are actually pushing for this opening of the borders. It's kind of a funny thing because when you read the headlines, and we have been in the spotlight probably more than what we really want to, but it seems that it's all about international students, and it's not. There are a lot of more things, and as a result of that, I think this chart really shows that it's more about that. And this gives us some reassurance that borders will open soon, because there's a lot of political and economic drivers that wants to keep those borders open, regardless what we see in the headlines. I think the numbers speaks by itself. But also, I think it's important to look back, and something that is really hard, because we have been for the last 20 months just thinking about COVID, that sometimes we need to remember that also there are some forces beyond COVID-19. And it was very interesting for us to look at this analysis done by Tourism Research Australia, which is a great entity that, among many other things, they look to estimate and forecast the international travel activity for Australia. Across the different forecasts, and this is done by a panel of experts every year, the last forecast, and this is what you see on the screen, actually shows that international travel, and once again, this is before COVID, nobody knew that this was coming, but before COVID, international travel was going to grow for Australia significantly. And the area of international travel that it was going to grow the most, it was education, which is the chart that you can see here on your screen. According to this panel, and we actually look into previous forecasts that they done, we went back to 2015 also, and they have been very, very accurate. But the area that they were expecting that they will grow the most is definitely education. And you can see what they were expecting and the forecast before COVID hit. Of course, we know that this has been disrupted, and this chart is not going to be very relevant at the moment. But what is relevant is the factors that are actually pushing for this growth on international travel. What this expert panel actually is looking, and you can actually find the documents there, is Tourism Research Australia from September. The factors that actually are moving international travel for education in particular are two who are very important, is demographic changes and economic growth. Basically what this panel identify, and that's why sometimes it's good just to go back to pre-COVID times. But basically what this panel identifies is that the growth in the population in the Asia-Pacific region and the economic growth in the Asia-Pacific region is creating, and this is something that we knew before, is creating this large middle class and a group that is going to be demanding international services, education services, and they will seek for those services abroad. Now, this is important because, as I said, we have been immersed so much in the world of COVID that sometimes it's easy to forget that there are other factors that will actually define the way in which you're going to move forward. And these are two factors that definitely COVID-19 has not touched. The demographic, basically the population has kept growing in the way in which it has been growing. COVID has not really affected that, but also the economic one. In terms of the economic recovery, it's important to say that it's expected that during this year and during 2022, the world economy will recover across many regions. What you can see on the screen is basically the projection coming from the International Monetary Fund, which actually is agreed by the main economic agencies around the world, which basically is telling us that the world will recover very soon. In fact, quicker than what everybody was expected. And the recession created by COVID-19 will actually fade away very, very soon. So this gives us reassurance that these two factors that actually will provide, once again, medium or long-term demand for education services will come in place sooner than we were expecting. And that is very important because we have been so immersed in thinking about the effects of COVID and COVID and COVID and COVID that we easily, and that makes complete sense, we have actually forgot what could be the main drivers that could lead for higher demand for our sector. So what we can expect is, looking back at this chart, is that although back in 2019 there was this expectation that it will keep growing, and then we'll be actually having this level of disruption that it reached around 400,000 in 2021, we can expect that we will see some steady growth in the following months, and these big economic drivers will actually play a more important role as it was done before in 2019. So as you can see, we are actually going to be in a world where we are going to be part of something bigger. There are big economic and political drivers that will open the borders sooner than we will expect. That's what we anticipate, and I think that's the hope that everybody has. And following this, I think that it's important to understand that, of course, our efforts just to keep doing that and to push for the return of international students will depend on other bigger factors. But those big factors are in our favor. So we will expect that it's in the horizon, and once again, sooner than where we're expecting to see the opening of borders that, of course, will give a more positive outlook to our opportunities and engagement with market in 2022. Now, the other big factor that we think will play a role in 2022 is competition. Although we expect that borders will open very soon, and of course, we expect that international students will return very soon, we need to be aware that some study destinations like the Canada and UK are actually taking a more active role in the market. These two countries have been actually starting their vaccination program way before Australia, and in fact, they have been easing borders way before Australia as well. And as a result of that, we now can confirm that both Canada and the UK are actually getting into level of student enrollments or student visas that they had previously in 2019. But what we think is super important is just to look into the detail and really see in which areas these two competitors may actually affect the engagement with market in 2022. So I'm going to just show with you some of the stats and some of the data that we already have available. Starting with the United Kingdom. As you can see on the screen, the number of higher education student visas, and this is the latest data available that we have from June to June in comparison to the last 4 years, shows that basically the United Kingdom is back to 2019 levels already. Now, for the UK, they have a September intake, which is the main intake. So whenever we get the September data set, this is just June, but when we get the September data set, it's very likely that they will be in a very positive number in comparison to 2019. Now, what I think is important to keep having a look is to understand in which areas or how this country, just like Canada, are actually fueling their recovery. As you can see, these are the top 10 nationalities for the United Kingdom based on higher education student visas. And as you can see, there are some interesting nationalities that not necessarily are part of the top markets that we have here in Australia. We have the case, for example, of Nigeria here, also cases like the United States, and even some cases like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, who are not part of the top 10 markets for Australia. So these markets have a very close engagement with the UK for many, many reasons. And those ones are actually fueling a lot of the growth that we have seen in the UK. So those efforts that the UK has done in terms of traveling, easing traveling restrictions, of course they are working. But in the way in which it seems that they are working is because they're actually helping them just to move that pipeline that they have with the markets then where they engage back in 2019 or back in 2020. It doesn't seem that is necessarily basically taking market share from other markets. It seems that they actually using that previous engagement what they have. For example, when India and Nigeria, they actually doubled the number of student visa holders. And this is, we know that they have been working in these markets for a long time. Interestingly, the case of China, where they are still 15% down in comparison to 2019, which shows that the engagement with this market is different, even though they have probably a way in which they have been opening borders in a kind of a similar way for everybody. Now, another important thing to say here is just to understand that it was nearly about 9 or 8 months since the UK started the easing of borders. It works very well for them in terms that the main intake will be in September, so they will see good results for the September intake. But we have been hearing people that they are saying, oh, the UK is 30% up. Well, they're 30% up in comparison to what they had in 2020. Really, in comparison to 2019, they are just experiencing the recovery. For ELICAS, the UK is actually still 42% down in comparison to 2019. So I think that also we're going to see that for different sectors, the easing of travel restrictions will be different. Now, in terms of Canada, Canada has done actually really well in terms of bouncing back. This is the August figures that we have, the latest figures that we have from Canada. Once again, they have a September intake where we actually going to be able to see whenever we get this data set, probably a more positive outlook for Canada. But at this stage, they are 6.1% up in comparison to 2019. So basically, they are in full recovery. But once again, when you see the nationalities that they are driving this recovery, it's interesting to see the cases like places like France, for example, which is not one of the top markets for Australia, even Iran, or places like, for example, South Korea, where they're actually 40% down, and Vietnam, and especially the US, Nigeria, and Mexico, where they are definitely not part of the top markets for Australia. Now, interesting to see that China for them is 40% down. So once again, every market is reacting in a different way. And of course, we need to acknowledge the fact of what's happening in the Philippines, where they basically double the numbers. So in that sense, yes. And of course, and this is the case also for the UK, the role of India is quite an interesting one. We know that in some markets, there is a higher engagement from these countries, but also because they are postgraduate markets, of course, they didn't want to wait until borders may open. They have their plans, and for those particular group of students, especially students from India in postgraduate education, they are actually open to consider all other destinations. So it's not every single student, but we need to have a close look just to ensure that the market is not affected or the student preferences are not affected if we delay the opening of the borders. But at this stage, this is where we at, and I think that as institutions, we need to start having a close look of what happened in there, but we need to have a detailed view and trying to drill down just to really understand where we have been affected by the closures of borders. Now, the other important thing that I think is important to acknowledge is that I think that we are making a mistake in talking about how these the study destinations have been very aggressive into the market. I hear that some education providers are saying that there's a very strong and aggressive competition from this market. I think it's a little bit different. I don't think we are dealing with a case of aggressive competition. I think that we're actually dealing with a case of competitive advantage. And there's a very big difference between aggressive competition and competitive advantage. Competitive advantage is when the circumstances, when the conditions in the market, they really help you just to have a superior position in market. Is the circumstances what really are helping these study destinations to be more attractive? And fair enough, like if I'm a student trying to look where I'm gonna go, I will look for those opportunities that are available in the market. But for us, it's important to understand that, because when you talk about competitive or competitiveness instead of a competitive advantage, I think it's important just to understand that it will be different in the way we actually handle our response. And this is because when we are talking about competitive advantage, when it's the circumstances, the ones who are affecting us, the response should come from an inward kind of focus. We don't need to worry as much about what the competitors are doing. When you're in a position of competitive advantage, it's all about understanding what are the circumstances, what the situation, how can I actually come out of that limitation that will actually allow me to engage with market more effectively. A good example of that is what happened to Samsung a few years ago. I don't know if you remember that Samsung had this super fancy Galaxy Note. And about 4 years ago, the Samsung Galaxy Note, if you remember, the battery has a lot of problems and they were actually exploding in people's pockets. So Samsung, as a result of that, they lost a lot of money, they damaged their brand, they had to recall all the devices. But then to re-engage with market, they actually had to do this inward kind of approach to look inside, to really understand what was the problem, to really understand how they damaged the market, and then from there they went out to re-engage. It was not about thinking about competitors like Apple or Google Pixel or anything like that. It was very different. And I think this is important for us here in Australia to understand that this is going to be this inward analysis, what is going to really help us. We need to understand where students are actually disengaging with us, whether students feel that we don't have an offer what they really understand, what kind of students and what kind of is going to be the message so we go out to the market. And I think we don't need to do this only as a sector. I think every education provider and university could do the same thing, could actually engage with that pool of applicants that we haven't compared, and we need to understand where they at. And I think we need to understand, although I know it's a little bit daunting, we need to understand, what are they think about 2020? What can we do so actually we can re-engage with them, or where do they feel that we have actually failed? But it's the inward kind of focus and not just focus about the competition. I think that would be a mistake, because it's not aggressive competition, it's competitive disadvantage what we're actually experiencing. And once again, this is the point. Because of that, as we see that restrictions start to ease, a very important part of 2020 is just to listen to the markets, to see where are the possibilities, where are we going to engage. And more importantly, with COVID-19 is the fact that the environment will be different. COVID-19 creates not only a level of disruption in how we engage with market or at what level, but what the students are expecting, what are the preferences of them. We know that now we're actually going to deal with a very different global environment, and a lot of things have changed. A lot of fundamental things in our lives have changed, and that of course affects also the way in which we engage with the students. A good example of that, and this is important because this is another very important part of 2022. We need to go out trying to understand where are the opportunities and where are the differences. For example, this is actually coming from QS, from the International Student Survey, which is
by far the largest survey of international students or international applicants, actually, that we had in the last, I think, 5, 6 years. And recently they asked a large group of international students, this is thousands of international students, who actually would like to engage with anybody in the world, what do they think about online degrees? If they will consider an online degree, if they wouldn't have to pay as much in their fees. And look at the response. Like 56% of students from Indonesia, they said yes, and nearly 50 from China, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines. There are some markets that will be interested in these new ways in which we're gonna engage with them. So I think it's very important that we don't jump into 2020 just trying to switch on the button and think that things will be normal. They will actually be quite different. And we need to understand that for some students, a hybrid mode would actually probably be interesting. Not necessarily a complete online degree, but these models that we create in Australia of eventually transferring to campus where you can start online, they might work really, really well in many markets. And we don't want to miss those opportunities. So I think it's important that we put some certain protocols and strategies in place to understand where we are and how the market will be engaging with us. So what can we expect in 2022? Well, of course, there are some very strong external forces, and those forces will actually will help us just to have a quicker than what we expect opening of borders, but also in a very sustainable way. We also gonna need to face this competition, but more than the aggressive competition that we think we're actually dealing with, which I'm not saying that there is none of it. Of course, there are some elements of that. But I think that the main element of competition is the competitive disadvantage that we have been facing, and how, when that is gone, how we're going to re-engage with markets. And of course, we're going to engage under a new environment that will have new opportunities, and how ready we are just to move ahead into all this. And
And
in order
I just want to share with you some of the scenarios that we see next year, because I think that there's some sort of a lot of conversations and sometimes an obsession that we need to bounce back to 2019 numbers. And I think that looking at some of the scenarios could actually help. What you see here is the trend of international student enrollments in Australia. This is just for higher education. And this is the historical yearly number of students for 2021, because we're in November. We just provide you an estimate. And let me just share with you some of the scenarios that we see it. So 2021, we're going to finish it with around 367 international student enrollments. It's a trend that unfortunately is obviously the trend that we don't want to see. It shows how difficult have been things with COVID-19, but it really tells us where we at in the way in which we move forward. We also need to remember that on average, about 65% of students every year progress to the next year. These are students, of course, that, they are doing programs who are in a duration of program of longer than 1 year. So 65% of the students actually will progress next year. And looking at that, I think that is very useful just to look at some scenarios of what can happen next year. So the first scenario is actually probably what it could be our worst case scenario, which is basically considering that 65% of the students in 2022 will progress next year. And we have about the same number of commencements of 2021. That means that we'll end in 2022 with nearly an 8% drop in enrollments in comparison to previous years. Now, I think this is our worst case scenario, and it's based on the fact that 2021, we had complete closed borders, universities were seriously affected with not a lot of resources, and that probably would be the worst thing that could happen. Now, a more likely scenario is just to look into, once again, when we have 65% of the students progressing, and we get the same number of commencements that we had in 2020. And just remember that in 2020, we had a 1 our first semester was actually pretty good, but our second semester was not great because that's when the borders closed. So thinking about that, we could actually have something similar. We could have probably a one intake with border closures and a second intake with open borders. Well, in 2020, we had 136 student commencements, which will actually mean that we'll actually increase the numbers about 2%. Okay, very, very far for 2019 numbers. In fact, a third scenario, which is okay, things are gonna go great, and we're actually gonna have the same commencements that we had in 2019, our best year in record. Well, even then, we will have a growth of 13.2% in enrollments, which will take us to very similar levels that the ones that we had in 2020, but not even close to 2019. So I think that we need to understand that it takes time in our sector. The things that we do, it takes time to rebuild what we have been doing. And I think that's a very important part of the strategy and in the way in which we move forward. I think that we need to move away from the idea of just bouncing back or a recovery. This is more about how we can actually take the steps just to actually go back to where we are. And these are the three scenarios that I can share with you. I know that my data geek friends probably are going to say, oh, this is a very simple way to see it. Well, simplicity really helps when you're actually dealing with very uncertain conditions. And I think it really helps us just to have a perspective of where we are or where we can actually be next year. Now, I should mention that these are the possible scenarios for student enrollments. But when we talk about revenue from international student fees, it will be very different. I think that there is a great possibility that we actually will increase the revenue. And the reason of this is because some of the factors that experienced and impacted universities in the last few months is not only the lack of student enrollments, but the fact that we actually had to put big scholarships in many ways, so discount the tuition fees. And also a lot of students who started online or were doing things online, they were taking a lower study load, which means that the revenue actually dropped more significantly for that. So the moment that we open borders and we don't need to put those discounts there, and the moment that students will go back to full study load, that actually is going to bring the revenue to a higher level, definitely in comparison to 2021. And that's an important thing because that increase and source of additional revenue are really going to help the sector, not only to the recovery, but to something that it seems is going to be the core of 2022. It's not only going to be a recovery time, but it's going to be more about the time to rebuild. It's going to be the time where institutions are going to be able to really understand where the market are, where the opportunities are, and how we can actually embrace this new environment where it could be hybrid modes, where students start a few semesters online and they come back, or through transnational pathways. All these new initiatives are going to be clearly identified in 2022. So I think that that's exactly where we need to go. We need to go with a perspective that 2022 definitely has a more positive vibe, but that doesn't mean that the recovery in numbers will come immediately, but also will give us the opportunity really just to embrace where we are. And I think that we just need to acknowledge the fact that we will still facing some uncertainties, but in a different way, definitely for next year. 2022 will clearly bring opportunities to rebuild, and for a country that is actually used to rebuild and to understand how we can innovate, I think there are clear possibilities for everybody there. But we're still going to need some of the detailed analysis just to understand how students are changing preferences or not. Are they going to particular countries, or which are the areas, which are the study levels, which are the actual markets who have been affected by everything that happened in the last 20 months? And especially, I think it's important just to acknowledge something that we have been saying the last 20 months. Institutional efforts, they make a big difference. They actually, is not only about these big global trends who are affecting all of us, but how we actually navigate the circumstances that we'll face next year will actually be very, very important. And I have to say that, unfortunately, I have seen some universities saying, oh no, 2022 is going to be very hard again. We're not going to put resources on that. Well, that will actually have a double impact in your results next year when others are actually putting strategies and resources in place just to really take advantage of those opportunities that I think they're going to come for next year. All right, well, I think it was a lot that we covered today. Probably it was too much. Sorry if it was the case. We'll send you all the information and all the slides to each one of you. As I said, if you have any additional question or you want to engage with us for anything else, you see something else, more than happy to have this conversation. I think we are heading into a few months where having conversation is going to be very useful. So we have a better understanding of where we are moving. Because as I said, although we have some uncertainties now, things are going to start getting some clarity. But then when we really go back to market, really, I think that's going to be quite interesting just to see and understand where the student preferences are. But definitely it seems that we can see the light out of the tunnel. And I think that the work done in the last 20 months is really going to help us just to recover and to build back sooner than what everybody expects. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your support. And we'll be in touch with you. So I'll say goodbye now.